Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating mystery about how some children learn language in big musical chunks rather than single words. You know, if you've ever felt like a child was communicating entirely in movie quotes or singing to get their point across, you are definitely going to want to pay close attention to this.
Like, take this phrase, for example. Zoom, 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 we're going to the moon. If a child just blurts this out of nowhere, are they pretending to be an astronaut? Or are they actually just trying to tell you, hey, I want to play? If you take it literally, you might miss the true meaning entirely. This is the perfect example of what we call Gestalt language processing. And today, we're going to learn exactly how to decode it.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to unravel the language mystery, look at the two paths to language, map out the stages of Gestalt processing, cover some actionable support strategies, and finally, we'll weigh the evidence debate.
All right, Section 1, the language mystery. Let's put on our detective hats.
So picture this scenario. A kid is just running around outside, playing with friends, and suddenly yells, "It's a brand new car!" Obviously, there's no vehicle around. What they're actually doing is using a phrase they heard an announcer yell on a game show. Why? Because they're feeling incredibly excited, and they've taken that entire phrase from one specific emotional context and just copy-pasted it into a completely different one to show how they feel.
This brings us to the core concept here, Gestalt. It's a German word, and it basically means a whole that's somehow different from the sum of its parts. In this context, it means a child has memorized a whole chunk of language, like the Twinkle Twinkle Little Stars song, to mean just one single concept. Like, if you always sang that song right before turning off the lights, the child might sing the entire song later just to say, "Turn off the lights." They aren't hearing the individual words at all. To them, that whole song is just one big block of meaning.
Moving right along to Section 2, two paths to language.
Now, we usually think of language development as analytic. Analytic learners are your word-by-word builders. They learn milk, then want milk, and eventually, I want to drink milk, brick by brick. But Gestalt learners do the exact opposite. They are chunk-by-chunk intonation babies. They adopt the whole phrase first. It's like they start with the pre-built house, a full sentence or a script, and only way later do they actually start breaking that house down into individual bricks. Section 3, Stages of Gestalt Processing. Let's see how this actually develops.
Looking at the natural language acquisition framework here, we see a really clear progression. A child starts out at stage 1 using those whole scripts and songs. Then, in stage 2, they start mixing and matching parts of those scripts. By stage 3, they finally break those chunks down into single words. And what's wild about this is that to an outsider, stage 3 actually looks like a regression, right? Like going from full sentences back to single words. But, according to this framework, it's actually a massive leap forward. It means they're finally getting that individual words are separate units. And from there, they move through the final stages to master original grammar.
And this brings up an absolutely crucial point. Echolalia, which you might hear called jargon or scripting, is not just meaningless repetition. It is literally the core of stage 1. It always carries communicative intent. When a kid repeats a line from Peppa Pig or Bluey, they really are trying to communicate with you. Our job is to do the detective work to figure out exactly what that intent is.
So what does this look like in real life? Well, you might notice a child mixing up pronouns. Because they're repeating exact chunks they've heard, they might say you or he instead of I. Like they might ask, "Are you ready to eat?" when they're actually trying to say, "I am hungry." Another big giveaway, a kid who hums rhythmically or lights up at really animated musical speech long before they ever speak a single word. They are heavily tuned into the melody of language.
Which leads us to a fascinating little milestone called mitigation. Like we talked about, it might seem like a step backward when they stop using full scripts, but mitigation is actually a huge leap toward linguistic independence. Imagine a kid learns the chunk, "make a circle," in therapy. Once they start mitigating, they start swapping out the pieces, creating flexible new phrases like make a oval, or even make a purple. They are finally taking that pre-built house apart and playing around with the bricks.
All right, Section 4, Strategies for Support. Here's what you can actually do. So how can parents and educators actually help? First off, instead of trying to stop the scripting, you've got to join in. Do that detective work. If a child points to a perfectly plain cake in a book and says, "red velvet cupcake," figure out why. Hey, maybe they ate a red velvet cupcake on the way home from the clinic once, and now that entire chunk just means cake to them. Validate it. Be like, "Yes, it's a cake. I like red velvet cupcakes too." Another absolute game changer is creating a Gestalt dictionary, so everyone,
teachers, family, knows exactly what the child's specific movie quotes actually translate to in everyday life. Now, this next one is a massive shift for a lot of adults because Gestalt processors pick up exact chunks. Hitting them with questions often just leads to them repeating the question right back at you. If you ask, "What color is this?" boom, they learn that exact phrase as a chunk. So instead, you want to directly model the statement you actually want them to learn. Just say, "It is blue," or use third-person narratives like, "I'm ready to eat," so they pick up the right pronoun chunk to use for themselves later.
And of course, utilizing the right tools is key. Things like visual schedules or chunk-based speech apps that let a kid press a button to say a full, functional phrase rather than just single words can seriously cut down on misunderstandings. Plus, just giving them extra processing time instead of rushing them is huge. It really prevents these kids from being mislabeled as unmotivated, when in reality, they're just processing language differently.
Finally, Section 5, the evidence debate. Let's look at the science.
We need to step back and look at the clinical and scientific perspectives impartially here, because there's a real debate between speech-language pathologists and board-certified behavior analysts. On one side, many SLPs enthusiastically use this natural language acquisition framework. They find it incredibly validating for autistic individuals and highly neurodiversity affirming because it treats echolalia as genuine, meaningful communication. On the flip side, BCBAs approach this with scientific skepticism. They definitely agree that kids use scripts, but they question the empirical evidence base here. They're skeptical that this is a fundamentally different path of language acquisition that demands a completely separate intervention model.
To kind of illustrate this tension, let's look at an example from the sources. Say a child memorizes a park sign that says, "Please do not feed the ducks, quack, quack." A BCBA might look at that and point out that counting this memorized 8-word signboard quote as an actual 8-word sentence could unintentionally push a parent into denial. Their concern is that it might mask a true language deficit, because the child isn't formulating an 8-word thought from scratch, right? They're basically just playing back a vocal recording.
And that right there is the core tension of the debate. It's about balancing the undeniable emotional validation that comes from truly understanding and honoring a child's scripts against the clinical need for proven empirical interventions that demonstrably build flexible language skills. It's a tough balancing act between acknowledging a plausible, affirming theory and demanding rigorous scientific evidence.
So I'll leave you with this to think about. If a child recites an 8-word movie quote, are they speaking in full sentences, or are they just beginning to find their first words? Whether you see Gestalt processing as a distinct neurological path or just a different stage of learning, the detective work required to understand these kids is pretty profound. I hope this explainer has empowered you to look at childhood communication in a whole new light. Thanks for joining me, and keep exploring.